down here in Texas.
What is up, my peeps? This is your boy Rob, Big Bad Bob Clark, here with you for episode 214 of the Lone Gunman podcast. And before we get into the nitty gritty of the show, I just wanted to sincerely thank everybody out there for your wonderful, amazing, encouraging feedback. I think I got one person that told me to kill myself. But there's always going to be haters. And I'm, of course, referring to my writing, the little bit of a beginning of the book that I started writing. It's going to be like my final act for everyone. So thank you sincerely for all the encouraging feedback. I will continue to write, and I will take all of your encouragement and advice under advisement. I think a lot of you are right in your recommendations. So I shall definitely keep plugging away at it. It's not going to be out anytime soon. It's something I do in my spare time, but I want to be able to cap this thing off when I end it in the right way. And not that I'm ending it anytime soon either, but just sincerely thank you for caring. Also, before we get started, normally I beat your brains in at the end of the show. Follow me on Twitter at TheLoneGunman7. Follow along, interact, and head over to YouTube and search for the Lone Gunman podcast channel. And please make sure you like, subscribe, and get notifications for new episodes dropping. Trying to get to 1,000. And when I get to 1,000, I promise to do a live video version of the show for everybody, where we can interact in real time and have some fun. So that's the goal, folks. That's the goal. All right. So, also, let me throw a couple more plugs in here. I will be on Roberta Glass's True Crime Report here in the coming weeks. So make sure you find Roberta Glass's True Crime Report. Say that 20 times fast. Wherever you listen to podcasts, she's all over the place. It's a great show, even if I'm not on it. So make sure you check it out and be aware that I did a massively long and in-depth interview with her. So check it out. Look for it coming soon. And also on the podcast with my friends Dave and Brad again from IP Frequently. I believe I've done their show twice before, and this will be my third time going back. I always have fun with those guys, so same deal. Even if I'm not on it, check out the show. They do a good one. And it is IP, just the letters I and P, and then Frequently. It'll pop up, trust me. So be on the lookout for all of that coming soon to your ears. All right, the first thing I want to run through here is a list of characters put together for the Assassination Records and Review Boards. And it details a lot of the people that we talk about on this show, and Doug talks about on his show, and me and Doug talk about on our show, Quick Hits, which you should be listening to, as well as the Dallas Action and the Lone Gunman podcast. Um, we get questions all the time. Who is this? Who is that? We talk about so many different people, and their involvement or tangentiality to the JFK assassination that I wanted to run down a list of characters and just briefly uh, let you know who they are and why they matter to the JFK assassination. And I think this will help um, those of you who don't do the deep dives into the documents. But some people do, and we talk about them, and we throw these names around like people know who the hell we're talking about when they don't. Um, and that's our fault. We got to realize that not as many people are deep into this stuff as we are. Even though you may like hearing about it, you might hear a name and it means nothing to you. But hopefully, this list of characters will give you a more in-depth knowledge base when we talk about these people on our shows. And I thought it was a good list that was put together for the ARRB, and we're going to go through some of them here. And in no particular order, folks. Uh, it's not alphabetical or anything. It's just as it is. So we'll jump right in here. John Martino. Okay. John Martino was an anti Castro activist who in 1964 claimed he had important information about the death of John F. Kennedy. Martino argued that Fidel Castro had planned the assassination of Kennedy as retaliation for an American plot to overthrow Castro's government. He claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald had been in Cuba in 1963 and was recruited by Cuban intelligence to kill Kennedy. Martino admitted uh, his role in the conspiracy as a courier delivering money to a friend and his wife named Fred Klassen and Florence Martino just before he died in 1975. Martino also confessed to a Miami Newsday reporter, John Cummings, that he had been guilty of spreading false stories implicating Oswald in the assassination of Kennedy, and instead suggested that two Cuban exiles were the gunmen, who are believed to be Herminio Diaz Garcia and Virgilio Gonzalez. Okay. And of course, there's more about John Martino. We talked about on the show. He was in prison in Cuba. With Santo Traficante and Lauren Hall and people like this, David Christ, um, probably a CIA uh, asset, if you will. Um, big money came through this guy's hands from the mafia. He had ties to them as well, and he's one of our favorite. Uh, you know, Jack, John, Jean, Martin, Martino, Martinez. Yeah, you get my drift. Okay, next up, we have Eugenio Martinez. Now, Eugenio Martinez was an anti-Castro activist born in Cuba, moved to Miami after Castro came to power in 1959. He was involved in Operation Tilt, which we'll get into in a second, and was one of 5 men recruited by G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt to commit the Watergate burglary in 1972. Eddie Bayo, anti-Castro activist, originally born in Cuba. In 1962, Bayo claimed that 2 officers in the Red Army based in Cuba wanted to defect to the U.S. Bayo said they were willing to pass on technical information about the warheads and missiles that were still in Cuba despite the agreement following the Cuban Missile Crisis, and several members of the anti-Castro community took up his story. This led to Operation Tilt, which was the unsuccessful attempt to get those Soviet officers out of Cuba, which Bayo himself participated in. The officers were not located, and the group returned to Miami. Bayo remained behind after the operation, and it is rumored that he had been captured and killed. So that is your Operation Tilt. Sylvia Odio was the daughter of an imprisoned Cuban refugee in prison for attempting to assassinate Castro with Manolo Rey's anti-Castro group. In her testimony, she says that on the evening of September 25th, 1963, her family home was visited by a man she says was Lee Harvey Oswald, based on pictures she was shown of him after the assassination. Note, she was visited by two Mexican men who claimed to be members of Jure, Jure, claiming, to be her father's friend. They said the third man, who was white, was named Leon. Presumably, Leon is Lee Harvey Oswald, based on the Odio incident. The presence of Oswald at the Odio residence would place Oswald as a member of a right-wing militant group. When the Warren report portrayed Oswald as a leftist sympathizer, also, according to the official timeline, Lee Harvey Oswald is supposed to be either on his way to Mexico or already in Mexico by this time. Next up, David Morales. He was a CIA employee, worked with a military cover, and in 1958 he moved to Cuba to support the Batista government. In 1965, according to CIA agent Tom Clines, Morales helped capture Che Guevara in Bolivia. And according to his friend, Ruben Carbajal, Morales also talked about his involvement in the Bay of Pigs. According to Carbajal, Morales claimed, quote, Kennedy had been responsible for him having to watch all the men he recruited and trained get killed, adding, quote, well, we took care of that son of a bitch, didn't we? Bradley Ayers of the Assassination Records Review Board also claims to have a credible witness who can place Morales at the Ambassador Hotel the night of the RFK assassination. Rip Robertson. Like I said, folks, you've heard these names, but do you really know them? Here we go. Rip Robertson was a U.S. Marine during World War II and then a CIA agent after the war. He was involved in the, quote, Executive Action Plan, a plan to remove unfriendly foreign leaders from power. Example, Guatemalan government of Arbenz in 1954. Robertson commanded a supply ship during the Bay of Pigs operation and blatantly disobeyed orders by landing in Cuba with Brigade 2506. Afterwards, he became a member of the CIA's JM Wave station in Miami, headed by Ted Shackley. Shackley and William Pauley later organized Operation Tilt to get two Soviet defectors in Cuba to the U.S. to gain information regarding atomic warheads and missiles, and assigned Robertson to help with the operation. Rip Robertson was a badass motherfucker, by the way. David Atlee Phillips, CIA employee. Phillips ran the propaganda campaign known as Operation Success in Guatemala against President Arbenz, as well as the CIA's Voice of Liberation radio station. He also worked undercover in Cuba from 1959 to 60 and was involved in the Bay of Pigs. During this period, he worked with E. Howard Hunt in the attempts to assassinate Castro. There have been claims from CIA agents and committee members that Phillips assumed the identity of Maurice Bishop during covert operations in Cuba, which we now know this is to be false. The group Alpha 66, established by Cuban exiles against Castro's regime, the group launched several raids on Cuba, was organized by Antonio Veciana in 1959, and received funding as well as operational guidance from the CIA. Veciana says the man known as Bishop was his case officer. Him and Bishop also worked on a plan to assassinate Castro. Although Phillips testified before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1978, saying he never used the name Bishop, his testimony compared with others and numerous document facts suggest that he was in fact the character Bishop. Now, of course, we know all this to be horseshit uh, by now. Again, this document was written more than 25 years ago with limited information. Antonio Veciana, he created Alpha 66, a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles that committed several raids on Cuba, uh, were funded and supported by the CIA after Castro took power in 1959. Um, he had worked with his caseworker, Bishop, during these raids and had also worked with him on a plan to assassinate Castro. March 1963, Alpha 66 attacks Russian ships docked in Cuba. Kennedy and the Department of State made it clear they did not support these attacks amidst a time of tension between the Soviet Union and the U.S. The group proceeded to attack another Soviet ship, which led to Kennedy to order Vesian and other leaders of Alpha 66 to be arrested and placed in a confined area in Florida. After the assassination of Kennedy, Vesiana began work for the International Development Agency under the State Department in Bolivia. During this time, he was still focused on an anti-communist activities, and in 1971 he was involved in another failed assassination attempt on Castro. William Harvey, former FBI officer who went to work for the CIA. Harvey was sent to West Germany, where he worked with Ted Shapley at the CIA Berlin station. Later, he would become part of the policy known as Executive Action, a plan to remove foreign leaders from power. This is one of the precursors to his involvement in anti-Castro activity, including his involvement in the 1961 plot to poison Castro. After the end of operations against Cuba in 1962, Harvey was sent to Italy, where he became chief of station in Rome. Johnny Rosselli, also known as Filippo Sacco, folks. Rosselli was a crime boss who first began working for Al Capone in the 1920s. By the end of World War II, he was one of the most powerful bosses in Las Vegas. The FBI identified him in 1947 as a leading figure in the mafia and a close associate of Santos Trafficante. Rosselli also participated in the 1961 plot against Castro, and it appears his goal was not just to assassinate Castro, but to leave evidence implicating the CIA as well. Rosselli told his attorney, Edward Morgan, that Castro had dispatched sniper teams to the U.S. to kill Kennedy in retaliation for plots against him. Rosselli was interviewed in 1975 about his relationship with the government, and it was from this interview that it emerged that Rosselli and Sam Giancana had been in talks with the CIA about killing Castro. In July of 76, Rosselli disappeared on his way to play golf. His body was brutally murdered, mutilated, and squished into an oil drum floating in the ocean 10 days after he disappeared. Always drill holes in your barrels if you want them to sink, folks, and not float. Next up, Tony Verona, a Cuban-born anti-communist who worked with Frank Sturgis and the CIA to plan a counter-revolution. In the late 50s, he moved to the U.S. and established the Movement for the Recovery of the Revolution, the MRR Party. Later, he became the head of the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the CRC. It has been documented that he worked closely with organized crime leaders such as Trafficante and Rosselli, and Verona was also involved in several assassination attempts on Castro. Richard Kane joined the army in the late 40s and was discharged in 1950. After discharging, he became friends with Private Detective John Bunes, a member of the OSS during World War II. whose most important clients was Batista and a friend, and he is sent to Cuba to monitor government activity for various clients in Miami. He moved to Chicago later in the late 50s and had contacted his old family friend and mob boss Sam Giancana. During this time, he became a made man in the Chicago outfit and led numerous burglaries for them. Later in 1956, with the help of Giancana, he was admitted into the Chicago Police Department as a bagman for Giancana. He was later, again with the help of Giancana, promoted to the Detective Bureau. After being caught installing a hidden camera in the Commissioner of Investigations room, he is forced to resign. And later, Giancana employed Kane to assassinate Castro after having met with the CIA and Allen Dulles regarding an assassination plot to kill Castro, awarding $150,000 for the completion of the task. In 1961, he moved to Mexico City to set up a base of operations for an investigative agency. It is believed that he was training Cuban expats for the second invasion of Cuba, working with Tony Verona and the Cuban Revolutionary Council to do so. He later returned to Chicago and worked again for the mob until his death in 1973, where he was murdered by two masked men who shot him in the face with a shotgun inside a restaurant before removing a slip of paper from his pockets and walking off. Damn, that's brutal. Desmond Fitzgerald, member of the OSS during World War II, he was an active member of the Republican Party before becoming executive officer of the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, Far Eastern Division. In 1962, he was appointed chief of the Cuban Task Force. Fitzgerald would personally be involved in multiple plots to try to assassinate Castro and continued to participate in planning in Cuba until operations against Castro ended. And in 1965, he was appointed as head of the Directorate for Plans. Desmond Fitzgerald died of a heart attack in Virginia while playing tennis on the court in July of 1967. Richard Helms, also an OSS agent who worked in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland after the war. He joined the CIA and helped successfully and covertly subvert the Communist Party during the Italian general election. By 1962, he was more deeply involved in Vietnam. After Kennedy was killed, Helms was given the job of investigating Lee Harvey Oswald and the CIA. He initially appointed John M. Whitten to do the agency's in-house investigation. Whitten originally concluded that Oswald had acted alone, but when Whitten realized the FBI had withheld important information on Oswald, he said his initial conclusion about the case was completely irrelevant. Helms responded by removing him from the case. Imagine that. Next up, we have Mr. Am World himself, Manuel Artime. Now, it's a very important cryptonym, a very important CIA operation to install Manuel Artime as the um, basically the head of Cuba in exile. Manuel Artime was a Cuban-born leading anti-communist. He worked closely with the Catholic University Association, helped plan a rebellion in Cuba against Castro organized by Frank Sturgis and the CIA. In 1959, he arranged for Sturgis to drop thousands of revolutionary leaflets in Havana by airplane. He then moved to the U.S. and worked to establish the Movement for the Recovery of the Revolution, the MPR Party. Artime, during this time, built strong relationships with Robert Kennedy. He took part in the Bay of Pigs invasion as one of the leaders of Brigade 2506. Artime was captured and then rescued by his friends who paid his ransom. He then worked with E. Howard Hunt on plots to kill Castro. And in 1963, he started to receive funds from the CIA via Ted Shackley. And during this time, Artime, alongside other influential Cubans, moved to Nicaragua, where they formed a 300-man army. They were covertly acquiring arms, supplies, and boats for an invasion of Cuba. After the assassination of Kennedy, Johnson canceled the second naval guerrilla operation. Imagine that. I mean, you can't exactly blame the man. You don't want a second Bay of Pigs fiasco going on while you're president that you didn't plan. So, yeah, there's that. Rafael Chichi Quintero. Disillusioned with Castro's government, Chichi joined Artime in his anti-Castro struggle. Chichi was part of Operation 40, the assassination group that would assassinate members of the military or political parties in foreign countries that the U.S. was going to infiltrate, in this case Cuba, and the plot to assassinate Castro. He was working with Artime when they moved to Nicaragua to form the Second Naval Guerrilla Operation. Chichi later was recruited by the CIA to assassinate certain people, including a Libyan dissident in Egypt. He remained involved in covert operations until his death in 2006. Hmm. Hmm. Well, with that date, it seems to me like this list might not have been prepared for the ARRB, which had been long dissolved by 2006. So, my apologies. I don't know where the hell this list came from. But it's a good list nonetheless. Well, it definitely helps identify the people and the characteristics and what they were associated with, what they were doing, and their names you hear dropped all the time, but you might not necessarily know what the hell they were doing. So whoever made this list, and for whatever reason they made this list, good job. Next up, Manny Manolo or Manuel Ray. He was originally supportive of Castro's regime, and Ray was he was the Minister of Public Works under Castro. And by the end of the first year, he had left Castro's government displeased. And in 1960, he had formed the Revolutionary Movement of the People, the MRP. Kennedy brought Ray on as chief of sabotage and internal affairs for the CIA. He also, during this time, became part of the Fronte Revolucionario Democrático, the FRD, and the Cuban Revolutionary Council, the CRC. After the failed invasion of Cuba, Ray withdrew the MRP from the CRC, criticizing the operation and showing up opposition to CIA-backed invasions. He resigned as the leader of the MRP and in 1962 formed a new anti-Castro organization called Junta Revolucionario Cubana, the Jure, Jure. He was caught having illegally purchased $50,000 worth of firearms for Jure, Jure from a California arms manufacturer, and as a result, he had to move all his operations outside of U.S. territory. In 1972, he formed the People's Revolutionary Party, the PRP. Failing to make an impact, he moved to Puerto Rico in 1978 and headed his own engineering and consulting firm. Carlos Prio Separas. Part of a coup that deposed Machado's dictatorship in Cuba in 1933, he was appointed Minister of Labor and then President in 1948. He was overthrown by Batista with U.S. support in 1952. Prio supported Castro financially during his conquest of Cuba, and in 1959, after Castro had gained power, he broke off connections and went to Miami, where he worked as a property developer and a businessman. Prio was linked in a testimony with Jack Ruby and Frank Sturgis that suggests he had information on the assassination of Kennedy. He was wanted for questioning by the Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977 and was found dead from a gunshot wound outside his Miami home that same year after having been summoned. Well, add him to the list. The infamous Des Moines Shield list, the Johnny Rosselli list, and the Giancana. Now we have Carlos Prios Aconis. Okay. Died during the HSCA investigation. Roy Hargraves. Now, we did a show not too long ago about Roy Hargraves. So you should be familiar, folks. He was a member of the Intercontinental Penetration Force group organized by Jerry Hemming. Hargraves trained anti-Castro Cuban exiles and in 1963 led a team of exiles in a successful raid on Cuba. This team captured 2 Cuban fishing boats and took them to the Bahamas. Working with Felipe Vidal Santiago, Hargraves carried out a series of raids on Cuba in the 60s. This included a plan intended to incite war with Cuba by simulating an attack on Guantanamo Naval Base. He later moved to Los Angeles, where he was involved in organizing bombing attacks on the Black Panthers and the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. As part of Operation Chaos, Roy Hargraves died in 2002. Felipe Vidal Santiago. Born in Cuba, Santiago was a Cuban naval officer who moved to Miami after Castro took power. He then joined Interpen, where he was involved in a series of raids against Cuba. Santiago was close friends with John Martino, first guy we talked about on this list, and had been involved in accumulating funds for anti-Castro exile groups. There is evidence, suggesting Santiago was involved in the assassination of JFK and that he was on the ground in Dealey Plaza during the assassination. Yeah. Bernardo de Torres, born in Cuba. He moved to Miami in 1955, where he worked as a private investigator. During the Bay of Pigs operation, Torres was chief of intelligence for Brigade 2506, working under David Sanchez Morales. He was captured during the operation and then released in late 1962. There exists evidence suggesting he was one of the 2, quote, Mexican men that visited Sylvia Odio. According to several testimonies, Torres had a strong connection to the CIA as well as a connection to the mafia. There exists strong evidence suggesting Torres to be heavily involved in the assassination plot and to have been in close contact with Oswald. Lauren Hall. Hey, we all knew this guy. Cuban born, but not really. Uh, yeah. He was actually born in Kansas, folks. He later joined the U.S. Army, and during Castro's revolution, he joined the rebel effort. Castro and Hall had a falling out, and Hall was imprisoned for a few months after moving to the U.S. He then joined Sturgis in the International Anti-Communist Brigade. Hall has connections with the mob bosses Trafficante, Giancana, and Rosselli, and testified that Giancana gave Eddie Bayo a $15,000 down payment for a raid on Cuba, known as Operation Tilt. He also testified he carried out missions against Cuba on behalf of the CIA alongside Rip Robertson. Frank Sturgis, otherwise known as Frank Fiorini. He joined the U.S. Marines in 1942 and served in the Pacific during World War II. In 1956, he moved to Cuba and traveled around South America. 2 years later, he made contact with the CIA and over the next few years worked as an undercover agent. He formed the Anti-Communist Brigade after Castro took power and was involved in numerous assassination attempts on Castro. Sturgis participated in the anti-Castro leaflet dropping raids in Cuba and had aided the CIA in organizing the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was also a member of Operation 40 and was one of the men arrested during the Watergate scandal, having been caught removing electronic devices from the Democratic Party campaign offices. Sturgis is also considered to be one of the key players involved in the JFK assassination. Bernard Barker, Cuban born, he became a U.S. citizen in 1935 and then joined the armed forces after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. After the war, he returned to Cuba and joined the National Police. He worked as an assistant to the chief of police as a sergeant. He was later recruited by the FBI and then the CIA. After Castro took power, he began working under E. Howard Hunt and recruited men into the 2506 Brigade, the Bay of Pigs Brigade. Barker was also involved in the Watergate conspiracy with Eugenio Martinez, Frank Sturgis, and E. Howard Hunt, and G. Gordon Liddy. E. Howard Hunt. During World War II, he served in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and after that, he joined the CIA. He was involved in operations in Guatemala against President Arbenz under the Executive Action Program. Hunt played an instrumental role in planning the Bay of Pigs operation and was then the CIA station chief in Mexico during the 1960s. He was also one of the key organizers of the Watergate burglary. Virgilio Gonzalez, born in Cuba, moved to Miami after Castro took power, becoming an active member of the anti-Castro movement or anti-Castro Cuban movement. Gonzalez was one of the men who went to Cuba for Operation Tilt and was also one of the men to break into the Watergate complex in the Watergate scandal. There exists evidence suggesting Gonzalez was involved in carrying out the assassination of JFK. Pardon me. Sergio Akasha Smith, Cuban born, he moved to the U.S. in 1945, where he attended college in Texas. He then returned to Cuba as consul in India under Batista. And when Castro came into power, he went into exile and formed the Cuban Democratic Liberation Front, the CDLF, with David Ferry. In 1962, he was expelled from the CDLF, accused of misappropriating funds. Jim Garrison unsuccessfully attempted to extradite Smith from Texas for questioning regarding the JFK assassination. Emilio Santana, a Cuban born, he moved to Miami after Castro took power. As a fisherman in Cuba, he was recruited by the CIA as a boat guide for infiltration missions. He was involved in operational missions until he was separated from the CIA in October of 1963. There exists evidence suggesting Santana to be involved in the JFK assassination. David Ferry, aeronautics teacher, who then worked as a pilot instructor for the Civil Air Patrol in Louisiana, where he met Oswald. He was involved in CIA assassination plots against Castro and also in the assassination of JFK. 5 days after it was reported that he was going to be investigated for the JFK assassination, David Ferry was found dead in his apartment due to an apparent suicidal overdose of pills. Again, each of these figures here probably have their own episode all unto themselves, and some of them I have done episodes all unto them of themselves. Um, like I said, these are very brief biopics um, for the benefit of those who may not have heard any of these names before. Next up, Orestes Pena, Cuban born, moved to U.S. where he owned a bar called the Havana Bar in New Orleans, Louisiana. Oswald came into his bar and made a commotion over the price of lemonade and tequila. According to Pena, Oswald was also complaining about capitalism while at the bar. Also, Pena believes Oswald had contact with FBI agent Warren DeBreeze while in New Orleans, Louisiana. Tony Suesta, born in Cuba. Suesta, moved to the U.S. after Castro took power. He helped to establish Alpha 66 and the Commandos Liberty anti-Castro groups and had worked closely with Eddie Bayo on Operation Tilt. Suesta carried out multiple raids in Cuba. He was captured during a mission in 1966 where his arm was blown off in an attempted suicide via setting off a grenade. He was later released in 1978 and afterwards met with Fabian Escalante, the head of Cuba's G2 spy agency, whom he told that he had been involved in the JFK assassination. Armenio Diaz Garcia, born in Cuba. Armenio Diaz Garcia was a bodyguard for Santos Traficante, who himself was a Cuban mafia boss. He was involved in multiple assassination attempts, including ones against Costa Rica President Figueres. He moved to the U.S. in July of 63, where he worked with Tony Verona. Evidence suggests that Garcia was involved in the JFK assassination, and later in December of 63, he was involved in assassination attempts on Castro and in providing weapons to anti-Castro groups. Garcia was killed during a mission to Cuba with Tony Suesta, where Tony was captured. Eladio de Valle, born in Cuba. De Valle was a congressman in Havana under Batista. After Castro assumed power, he moved to Florida, where he was involved in the Free Cuba Committee, as well as worked for Traficante and David Ferry involving Cuban raids. He was murdered hours after David Ferry had been killed. He was tortured, had his head split open with an axe, and was shot in the heart at point blank range and stuffed in a drum. Testimonies suggested Duvalier was involved in the JFK assassination and had been killed because of his involvement. Santos Traficante. After his father, Santos Traficante Sr., passed away in 1954, Traficante Jr. took over his father's mafia empire in Cuba. Traficante had many ties with the CIA, especially with Allen Dulles, whom he spoke with regarding assassination attempts on Castro. He had connections with Jack Ruby, among other key players in the case, and a large amount of evidence suggests he was involved in the planning stages of the JFK assassination. Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, if you don't know who Lee Harvey Oswald was, you shouldn't probably be investigating this case, but I'll read you the blurb anyway. Oswald joined the Civil Air Patrol in 1955, working under David Ferry. During this time, he began learning Russian and was intrigued by Marxism. Oswald later joined the Marines for a few years after leaving and heading to Moscow and applying to be a Soviet citizen. It is suggested that Oswald was a CIA dangle, having been dangled into Russia as a double agent, hoping the Soviets would make him into a spy. His application for citizenship was rejected. He then attempted suicide, which ultimately allowed him to remain in the country. He then married his wife, whose father, actually uncle, was a high-ranking Russian commander in their version of the FBI, and then moved back to the U.S. in 1962 Back in the U.S., Oswald moved to Texas, where he and his wife became good friends with the wealthy white Russian anti-communists who fought the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War community that included George de Mohrenschildt. Oswald was accused of having attempted an assassination on the life of General Edwin Walker, a right-wing political leader, and also killing Dallas patrolman J.D. Tippit on the day of the assassination. He was also accused and found guilty of being the lone gunman who murdered JFK through heaps of evidence, although heaps of evidence suggests this to be untrue. Well, I think he was accused. I don't think he was ever found guilty by any judicial board, maybe in the eyes of the Warren Commission, but ultimately they have no judicial power. William Seymour, folks. Seymour spent his early life in the U.S. Navy and as a member of Interpen. Interpen was involved in training anti-Castro Cuban groups funded by the CIA. The group carried out a series of raids in Cuba in order to undermine Castro's new government. Seymour is assumed to be one of the men that had visited Odio in the Odio incident. Lawrence Howard, Fat Larry, a member of Interpen who worked closely alongside William Seymour and Lauren Hall. He had associations with David Ferrie in New Orleans and has been said to have been involved in the assassination. Howard is also assumed to be one of the men having visited Odio during the Odio incident with Seymour and Hall. Ted Shackley, also known as the Blonde Ghost. That's a badass nickname for a badass dude. Shackley joined the U.S. Army in 1945 and then was recruited into the counterintelligence corps. In the early 50s, he was recruited by the CIA and worked closely with William Harvey. He was involved in the executive action plan to remove unfriendly foreign leaders from power and many, many CIA black operations. In 1962, he was working with Harvey as the deputy chief of JM Wave. He gained control of Operation 40 after having been involved in assassination attempts on Castro. Shackley was responsible for gathering intelligence and recruiting spies in Cuba and played a vital part in organizing Operation Tilt. After this operation proved unsuccessful, Shackley returned to attempts at assassinating Castro using the team from Operation 40. Evidence suggests that Shackley may have been involved in the planning of the JFK assassination. Allen Dulles, grandson of Secretary of State John Foster Watson, a nephew of Secretary of State Robert Lansing, and brother of John Foster Dulles. He worked at Sullivan and Cromwell while his brother led the firm. He spied on the Nazis during World War II and was one of the founding members of the CIA after the war. He was CIA director during Eisenhower, while his brother was Secretary of State. He continued to be CIA director during Kennedy's term until he was fired by Kennedy after the whole Bay of Pigs debacle. So there's your list, folks, of some of the names that you might hear us drop on various shows that you may really didn't really know who they were. Hopefully this helps shed a little bit of light on that, and or it might have created more questions for you. I don't know. But anyway, it gives you a good starting point if you would like to continue investigating some of these names to go ahead and drop down several of the rabbit holes out there and check them out. I just thought it was a nice, good, cool list that somebody put together for some reason, apparently not for the ARB, um, like I thought, but decent list nonetheless. Of course, it could have gone into a lot more detail. This is more of a briefing sheet or a list of characters um, and their somewhat alleged involvement in the Kennedy assassination story. What is a cryptonym? Well, a cryptonym by definition is a code name. Okay. And there's lots of cryptonyms associated with the CIA that it gives to certain people or events or plans. And maybe this has been out there before, but I hadn't stumbled across it before. But one of the cryptonyms that CIA used to identify Felipe Vidal Santiago, was AmQuip1. And this was, I guess, uploaded to the Mary Farrell site by Bill Simpich and put together from a list of documents. And some of the documents, and I'll just briefly tell you what they said, referring to Felipe Vidal Santiago. This document on page 32 shows that on June 6, 63, the special group Augmented discussed various possibilities of establishing channels of communication to Castro. Vidal had previously got wind of this through Colonel Bishop and was livid. On this memo, Bill Harvey refers to Vidal Santiago in his June 21st, 62 report. In this document, Vidal Santiago is on the 1963 list of Cuban raiders ordered not to depart. Born in February of 1926 in Havana, he was a Cuban Naval Academy graduate in 1946. He founded the Movimiento de Liberación Democrático Revolucionario, the MLDR. He was the naval assistant to the Minister of Defense from 1954 to 56, the head of maritime police. In 1959, he was the Cuban naval attaché in Venezuela when he defected. A founder of UFLN. UFLN leader was Humberto Núñez Espinosa. The plan was on March 25th of 63 for Vidal and Evelio Duque planned to smuggle arms to 5 guerrilla units in the Escambray Mountains. This operation was suspended when Vidal learned Duque was working with William Johnson and Frank Sturgis, and that Duque was spreading false rumors about Vidal. So, interesting that the CIA decided to give cryptonym to Felipe Vidal Santiago of AmQuip1. See also Amot2, Amwhale3, LieTag1, and LieTaint1. Damn it, Doug, somebody stole our cryptonym. Somebody is already LieTaint1. Oh well, what are you going to do? Anyway, that's it for this episode, folks. I want to thank you again for tuning in and being a part of the show. Thanks for all your awesome feedback. Stay tuned, because next weekend we will be recording Quick Hits on the 20th. So make sure you get your questions to @QuickHitsJFK. Hold on. That's wrong. QuickHitsJFK@gmail.com. Get your questions, your comments into us, and we will read them live on the air, just for you. And we might even have a special guest for you. I don't know. So there may or may not be another TLG episode next weekend. I don't know yet. I'm going to try, but you know how things go. But if not, you will at least get another exciting episode of Quick Hits that I do with my buddy Doug. Make sure you're checking that out. Like and subscribe. Share the show, folks. Share with all your friends and family. Give them a link to listen. For fuck's sake. All right. That's enough for 1 week. This is your boy, and I is out of this bitch. They both gone and no one left to turn, and all been on Wall Street trade.
Big bad Bob with you.